Something changed around 2022 and nobody really wants to say it out loud. The average 22-year-old today expects to leave their first job within 18 months. Not because they're lazy, not because they have short attention spans, because they did the math and the math said leave. Meanwhile, every LinkedIn think piece written by a 50-year-old VP is framing this as a generational character flaw, a patience problem, a loyalty crisis. Here is a number that should stop you cold. Between 1980 and 2000, real wages for the bottom 60% of earners grew by approximately 8% total over 20 years. Meanwhile, productivity in the same period grew by roughly 60%. So workers produced 60% more value and received 8% more pay. That's not a rounding error. That's a structural decision. And Gen Z is the first generation to enter the workforce already knowing that statistic. So the question isn't why are they leaving jobs without apologizing. The question is, why did anyone stay quiet this long? We're going to explain how the employment contract actually works, why the incentive structure inside it is fundamentally broken, and why the mass exit of young workers from traditional corporate loyalty is not a cultural mood, but a rational response to a system that stopped hiding what it is. And yeah, it's getting weird. The central metaphor I want you to hold on to throughout this entire video is a conveyor belt. Not a ladder, not a game, a conveyor belt. Because a ladder implies you can choose your speed. A conveyor belt moves at a fixed rate regardless of how fast you run on it. You can be the smartest person in the room. You can work 70 hours a week. You can care deeply about the company mission. And the belt moves exactly as fast as it was always going to move. The only way to meaningfully change your speed is to step off this belt and onto a different one. Or build your own. That's the frame. Remember it. Now, the first thing I want to establish is what most people think is happening versus what is actually happening. Most people think Gen Z leaving jobs quickly is about impatience, entitlement, or the inability to handle difficulty. That's the surface level red, the one that makes for easy tweets and easy panel discussions and easy TED Talks from people who last interviewed for a job in 2004. What's actually happening is a negotiation, a collective, mostly unconscious renegotiation of the employment contract. And that contract had a very specific set of unwritten terms that quietly expired and nobody sent the renewal notice. Let me explain those terms because this is where it gets interesting. The old employment contract, the one that existed roughly from the 1950s through to the early 2000s, was built on 4 implicit promises. Stay loyal, receive security, put in time, receive advancement, trust the institution will protect you, and suppress your market value for now. You'll be compensated for it over a long enough timeline. Every one of those 4 promises has been broken systematically over the last 25 years. Not by accident. By deliberate corporate restructuring designed to shift risk from the institution onto the individual. The pension disappeared. The defined benefit plan that would pay you a fixed income in retirement, regardless of market conditions, was replaced with the 401k, which means you now bear the investment risk that the company used to absorb. That's not a small shift. That's moving a massive liability off the corporate balance sheet and putting it in your personal hands. Layoffs stopped being a last resort and became a costly tool. Companies discovered around the late 1990s that announcing large layoffs could actually boost stock price in the short term. The market rewarded it. So, the incentive calculus changed. Cutting people wasn't a failure of the business anymore. It was a performance signal. And once that norm was established, the idea that your employer would protect you during a downturn because you had been loyal became charitably optimistic. Promotions became slower and more political. The average time between promotions in large American corporations went from roughly 3 years in the 1980s to closer to 5 or 6 years by 2015. And the variance increased massively, meaning the difference between someone who got promoted and someone who didn't stopped correlating cleanly with performance and started correlating more with visibility, sponsorship, and internal politics. And pay transparency, or the lack of it, became the primary tool for keeping workers from realizing how undervalued they were. So, you have a generation entering the workforce with smartphones, with Reddit salary threads, with LinkedIn salary data, with Glassdoor reviews that are 3 years old but still useful, with Discord servers where people in the same roles at competing companies are openly sharing what they make. And they're doing a comparison that previous generations literally could not do. They are comparing their belt speed to every other belt in the warehouse in real time. That's new, and it changes everything. Here's the thing about information asymmetry. It's one of the most powerful forces in economics and is almost never talked about in plain language. Information asymmetry just means one side of a transaction knows more than the other side. And whoever has more information almost always wins. For most of the 20th century, the employer had all the information. They knew what comparable salaries looked like. They knew what the budget was. They knew what internal pay band said you were worth. They knew your replacement cost. You didn't know any of that. You were negotiating blind in a room where they could see the cards. The internet broke that asymmetry slowly, snorts, at first. Then all at once around 2018-2019, when a combination of pay transparency laws in certain states and the explosion of crowdsourced salary data made it so that any reasonably curious person could figure out within about 15% what they should be making in their role in their city at their level of experience. Gen Z is the first generation to enter the workforce after that shift was complete. They have never known what it's like to not be able to look up what the person sitting next to them is probably making. And what they found when they looked it up was pretty consistently the same thing. The external market valued their skills materially higher than their current employer did. And the gap wasn't small. Here's a pattern that shows up so consistently across industries, it's almost embarrassing. Let's say someone joins a company at $65,000 a year. Industry standard for that role is about $70,000. But the company justified the offer by saying, "There's room to grow. We do annual reviews. We take care of our people." 12 months later at the annual review, they receive a 4% raise, which takes them to $67,600. Meanwhile, the market for that same role has moved up. It's now $75,000 at comparable companies. So, they are now further behind the market than when they started. Not because they performed poorly, because the internal raise structure moves slower than the external market. They leave, they get a new offer at $78,000, a 23% increase from where they were. They started the new company, and within a year, the cycle begins again. And here's the thing that kills me about this story. The company that lost them could have retained them for $75,000, but the raise budget didn't allow it. Or more precisely, the incentive structure for middle management didn't reward retention. The manager had no personal upside from fighting for a budget exception to keep a good employee, but they had no personal downside either from losing one. The replacement would just be someone else's problem to onboard. You think the problem is employee disloyalty, but actually the problem is that retention was never anyone's job. This is what I mean when I say attack incentives, not individuals. The manager wasn't bad. The HR system wasn't bad. The employee wasn't bad. The incentive structure created an outcome that everyone involved would privately say was dumb and nobody had the structural power or motivation to fix. The conveyor belt was moving at a fixed speed. Someone looked over and saw another belt moving faster. They stepped across. Belt 1 acted surprised, but Belt 1 set its own speed. Now I want to go one level deeper because the salary thing is obvious. People have been job hopping for salary for decades. What's different now isn't just the magnitude of the pay gap. It's the identity layer underneath it. Previous generations, broadly speaking, organized a significant portion of their identitational affiliation. Where you worked was part of who you were. Saying you worked at a large, prestigious company meant something socially. It conferred status. It signaled stability. It answered a lot of awkward questions at family dinners. Gen Z has an almost allergic reaction to this framing. And I think it's misread constantly as arrogance or selfishness. What it actually is a different architecture of identity. One that's organized around skills, projects, and output rather than institutional loyalty. Think about how that shift happened when you grow up watching your parents' companies announced rounds of layoffs every few years. When you watch the 2008 financial crisis wipe out the retirement accounts of people who did everything right and stayed loyal and trusted the institution. When you enter the workforce during a pandemic that demonstrated in real time that companies would cut workers before they would cut executive compensation. When all of that is your formative context, it would actually be irrational to anchor your identity to an institution that has repeatedly demonstrated it does not reciprocate that attachment. So, the response is not emotional. It's structural. Don't anchor your identity to something that can revoke its relationship with you unilaterally without notice. Anchor it to something portable. Anchor it to what you can do, not where you do it. And when identity is portable, leaving a job becomes dramatically less psychologically costly. There's no crisis of self when you quit. You didn't lose your identity. You just changed the venue where you apply it. That's why Gen Z can leave jobs without apologizing in a way that genuinely confuses older managers. The manager expects the employee to feel something. Some guilt, some ambivalence, some acknowledgement that leaving is a loss. Instead, they get a politely worded 2 weeks notice and a LinkedIn post about new beginnings. And the manager feels weirdly disrespected by the absence of drama. But the employee isn't being disrespectful. They're just not experiencing the emotional weight the manager expected because the emotional architecture is different. If you're finding this useful, just subscribe. I put out one of these a week and each one is a different lens on how money and systems actually work. It's free. Just stay in the loop. Now, let me talk about something that almost no one addresses when they cover this topic, the risk calculation. There's a thing I call the loyalty tax. And I want to explain it with math because the math is where it stops being abstract. Imagine two people, same age, same starting salary of $60,000 per year, same skills, entering the workforce at 22. Call them Person A and Person B. Person A believes in loyalty, stays at the same company, gets annual raises of 4%. Doesn't rock the boat, is rewarded after 8 years with a senior title and a salary of about $82,000. Person B switches jobs every 18 to 24 months. Each switch earns a 15 to 20% salary increase, which is conservative based on current data. After 8 years, the compounding looks like this. Start at $60,000. Switch at year 2 to $71,000. Switch at year 4 to $83,000. Switch at year 6 to $97,000. After year 8, switching again at $113,000. Person A at year 8 is making $82,000. Person B is making $113,000. That's a $31,000 annual gap, but it's worse than that because the gap has been accumulating every year. The total earnings difference over those 8 years is somewhere in the range of $120 to $150,000 in cumulative income. And here's where it gets actually painful. Benefits, 401k matches, bonuses, and stock grants are all calculated as a percentage of base salary. So the higher base doesn't just affect take-home pay. It affects every single thing attached to that number. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but Person B had to deal with the stress of job searching, onboarding at new companies, building new relationships, proving themselves repeatedly. That's true. That's a real cost. I'm not pretending it isn't. But you have to compare that cost to $120,000 of foregone income and ask yourself honestly, which one is actually riskier? Because here's the thing about stability. The word is doing a lot of work that it shouldn't be doing. Staying at one company for 8 years feels stable. But if that company has a rough quarter in year 7 and needs to cut 15% of staff, Person A with their $82,000 salary and 8 years of institutional knowledge is not actually safe. They're just as fireable as anyone else. Possibly more so because they're at the top of the salary band for their level and a cheaper replacement from outside looks attractive on a spreadsheet. Loyalty was never really ensured by the company. It was a belief system that the company gently encouraged because it benefited them enormously. An employee who believes in loyalty is an employee who doesn't test the market, doesn't counteroffer, and doesn't realize they're underpriced until it's 8 years too late. So, the stability Person A was protecting was always partially fictional. Meanwhile, Person B has 8 years of experience at multiple companies, a network spread across 4 or 5 organizations, demonstrated ability to adapt and ramp quickly, and a salary that reflects their actual market value. Which one is actually more resilient if the economy turns bad? Let me do a quick comedic cutaway here because I feel like I've been running serious for a while. Picture the LinkedIn post. Quote, "After an incredible 12-year journey at Megacorp Industries, I am thrilled to announce my transition to the next chapter. This company gave me so much. I will cherish every single performance review that told me I was exceeding expectations while also explaining why there was no budget for a raise this year. Truly a once-in-a-lifetime experience. Open to opportunities." 600 likes, 40 comments saying you'll be missed from people who are also updating their resumes as we speak. Okay, back to systems. Let me talk about the thing underneath the thing because we've covered pay, we've covered identity, we've covered risk calculation, but there's a fourth layer that I think is the most interesting one. The psychological contract, not the legal contract, the psychological one. The set of unspoken expectations between employer and employee that shapes behavior far more powerfully than anything written in an offer letter. Here's how the old psychological contract worked. The employee's side said, "I will give you loyalty, discretionary effort, institutional knowledge, willingness to go above and beyond during crunch periods, and social promotion of the company's reputation." In exchange, the company side implicitly promised, "We will reward your tenure, protect you during downturns to the extent possible, invest in your development, and recognize your contributions beyond what the explicit compensation structure requires." That was the deal. Not written anywhere but real, operating underneath every performance review, every team offsite, every Friday all hands. That contract got broken first by companies, not by employees. The wave of corporate downsizing in the 1990s was the first major signal. Companies discovered that shareholder value and employee security were in direct tension, and they chose shareholder value consistently, not because executives were evil, because the incentive structure for executives was directly tied to stock performance, and stock performance responded positively to cost-cutting. Again, incentives, not individuals. By the time 2008 hit and companies laid off millions of workers, including many people who had been loyal for decades, the psychological contract was in ruins. But most workers over 40 had so much invested in the belief that it still existed that they couldn't quite acknowledge what had happened. They absorbed the cognitive dissonance and kept working. Gen Z arrived after the ruins were already cold. They never signed the old psychological contract because they watched it fail in high definition during their formative years. They're not breaking a promise. They never made that specific promise. And they're being faulted for it as if they had. This is actually a fascinating sociological moment if you step back from it. You have two groups of people in the same office building operating under fundamentally different assumptions about what the relationship is. The manager assumes there is a loyalty security exchange happening. The Gen Z employee knows there isn't one and is purely in a market transaction. And they're both acting rationally given their assumptions. They just can't hear each other because they're not even arguing about the same thing. The manager says you left after only 14 months. That shows no loyalty. The employee hears you failed to match market compensation and are now describing that as my character flaw. Both of those reads are accurate. That's what makes it complicated. Mini case study time. I want to walk through one realistic scenario in detail. Let's call our subject Marcus. 24 years old, computer science degree, graduates in 2023 with student loan debt of $68,000. Gets a job at a mid-size software company at $78,000 per year. Solid offer. He's happy. 6 months in, Marcus is doing well. His manager likes him. He's hitting his metrics. He starts getting curious about compensation because he joined a Slack community for developers in his city. He finds out that two people in that community with comparable experience are making $91,000 and $94,000 respectively at different companies. He also notices that a job posting went up at his own company for a role identical to his at a posted range of $85,000 to $95,000. His company is actively recruiting people from outside to do the same job at a potentially higher salary than what they pay him. He schedules a meeting with his manager, explains that he's been performing well, wants to have a conversation about compensation alignment with market rates. The manager, who is genuinely sympathetic, says the next review cycle is in 8 months, and there's a process to follow. He offers to note the conversation in Marcus' file. 8 months later, Marcus gets a raise of 5%. That takes him to $81,900. The external market for his role is now around $95,000 to $100,000. The gap has widened. Marcus, being methodical about this, calculates the following. He is currently approximately $13,000 to $18,000 below market. If that gap persists for 3 years, that's between $39,000 and $54,000 of foregone income. Against his $68,000 student loan balance, that's significant. He starts interviewing. Within 6 weeks, he has an offer at $96,000 from a different company. He goes back to his current employer. They offer $86,000 as a counter. He takes the external offer. Now, here's where the story gets instructive. His manager, despite being sympathetic, spent zero political capital trying to get Marcus appropriately compensated during those 14 months. Not because the manager is bad, but because the manager's performance metrics don't include retention of junior staff. The manager's raise budget was fixed at a percentage of salary pool. Fighting for Marcus would have required going to HR and making a case for a budget exception, which is a political expenditure with unclear personal upside for the manager. The company then spends approximately $19,000 on recruiting fees to find Marcus' replacement. Then spends 4 to 6 months in productivity drag while the replacement ramps up. Total cost to the organization of not paying Marcus $96,000 when he first asked is somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000. The math was obvious. The incentive structure prevented the obvious response. Marcus, for his part, doesn't feel guilty. He tried the internal route. He was told to wait. He waited. The outcome didn't change enough to stay. He is now 400 miles away from his original company's office, making $96,000. And his LinkedIn post described himself as a software engineer, not as an employee of a specific company. He is, by every measure that matters to him, better off. And here's the thing about Marcus that I think is underappreciated. His willingness to leave made him better at his job. He knows his market value. He has interviewed and won competitive offers. He understands what skills are actually valued externally versus what skills feel important internally. That knowledge makes him sharper in negotiation, sharper in evaluating opportunities, sharper in deciding what to learn next. The employee who never leaves, who is always told they're valued without that value being tested in a market, often becomes progressively more disconnected from what the actual labor market wants. Their skills calcify around what their current employer needs rather than what the broader market rewards. And when they finally do leave or get laid off after 15 years, they find the re-entry is rough. The conveyor belt metaphor works here, too. If you've only ever been on one belt, you don't know your own speed. You don't know if you're fast or slow relative to other belts. You've been measured only against the benchmark set by the belt you're standing on. The moment you step off and walk into an interview, you find out very quickly what the market actually thinks of you. Sometimes that's pleasant. Sometimes it's clarifying in a painful way, but it's real data. Staying on one belt your entire career feels like loyalty, but it can also function as avoidance of the discomfort of real market feedback. Let me do the second comedic cutaway. The all-hands meeting where the CEO announces that despite record profits this quarter, merit increases will be capped at 3% due to macroeconomic headwinds. Someone in the back row is on their phone scheduling an interview. Someone else is doing the same. The CEO closes with, "Our people are our greatest asset." 57 people in that room update their LinkedIn to open to work before the day ends. The stock goes up 4% the next morning. Great system. Now, I want to make sure I'm being fair here because I think intellectual honesty requires saying the uncomfortable part of this story. There are real costs to the world where everyone is always leaving. Institutional knowledge matters. When someone with 10 years of domain expertise leaves, some of what they knew is genuinely irreplaceable in the short term. Onboarding is expensive, not just financially, but in terms of cultural cohesion and team trust. Relationships that take years to build between teams or between companies and clients have real economic value, and they don't transfer automatically with a new hire. There are also careers where staying actually pays off. Surgery, law partner track, certain academic disciplines, careers with genuine credentialing hierarchies where tenure signals real accumulated expertise. If you're a cardiac surgeon who changes hospitals every 18 months, patients and colleagues are going to have reasonable concerns. Context matters. And honestly, not everyone who leaves a job quickly is operating with perfect rationality. Some people are fleeing discomfort that would have been growth. Some are optimizing for a salary number without thinking about the learning environment or the network quality of the opportunity they're leaving behind. A 60% salary increase to go work somewhere with bad managers and no career growth is not obviously the right move. The math has to include more variables than the base pay. But here's the critical distinction. The previous version of career advice said loyalty is virtuous by default. Leaving is a character flaw by default. The new version shouldn't just flip that and say leaving is virtuous by default. Staying as a character flaw. Both versions are wrong because both are defaulting to a moral frame when the actual frame is strategic. The question is never should I stay or should I leave as an abstract matter of character. The question is always what are the actual incentive structures at this institution? What is the trajectory of my compensation relative to the market? What is the quality of the learning and network I'm accessing here? And what is the realistic probability that staying another year materially improves my position versus merely delaying the same conversation I'd have to have if I left? That's a calculation, not a loyalty test. And the reason Gen Z is better at making that calculation isn't that they're smarter than previous generations. It's that they have more data and less social shame about using it. The social norm that said talking openly about salary was uncool or that leaving a job required elaborate justification was always a norm that served employers more than employees. Let me go deeper now because there's a third layer here that I think is actually the most consequential one for anyone trying to build real financial independence. There's a concept I think of as belt dependency, and it's the most insidious trap in the employment game. Belt dependency is what happens when your financial survival is so tightly linked to your current employer that you lose the ability to make rational decisions about your relationship with them. You can't leave even when the economics clearly say you should. Not because leaving is actually dangerous, but because the feeling of dependency has become so embedded that the prospect of leaving triggers the same psychological response as a physical threat. This is how many people end up staying in jobs that are gradually underpaying them for 5, 8, 10 years. Not because they thought it was a good deal, but because the monthly salary hitting their bank account had become so foundational to their sense of financial stability that disrupting it felt catastrophically risky, even when the disruption would have been temporary and the upside was clear. The company doesn't need to threaten you. The dependency does the work for them, and the way belt dependency builds is slow enough that most people don't notice it happening. You take the job. You structure your life around the salary. Your rent reflects the salary. Your car payment reflects the salary. Your lifestyle reflects the salary. And then 2 years in, when the opportunity to leave for more money arrives, the practical calculation isn't just salary A versus salary B. It's salary A versus the risk of a gap between jobs times all of your fixed monthly expenses times your emotional tolerance for financial uncertainty, which is a much harder calculation. And the company's incentive is for you to make it as hard as possible by normalizing lifestyle expansion to income. Which is why raises feel good in ways that are disproportionate to their actual size. A 4% raise isn't meaningful in absolute terms, but it's meaningful as a signal that the machine is still running, that you are still connected to the belt, that the monthly income is still safe. Gen's approach to this, deliberately or instinctively, is to delay belt dependency for as long as possible, or to build parallel income streams that reduce it, or to keep fixed expenses low enough that a month between jobs is uncomfortable but survivable rather than catastrophic. The demographic data on this is interesting. Gen Z has lower rates of car ownership, higher rates of roommate households into their mid-20s, and lower rates of consumer debt than previous generations at the same age. That's usually reported as a failure. They can't afford cars. They can't afford to live alone. They're behind economically. But look at the incentive implication. If your fixed monthly expenses are lower, your switching cost is lower. You can leave a bad job faster. You can hold out longer for the right offer. You can afford to walk away from a counter offer that's insulting without having a panic attack about your mortgage. The lifestyle arbitrage is not just frugality, it's leverage. Keeping your overhead low is the same as keeping your options open. And options are worth money. Real money. The quantifiable kind. I'll put a number on it. If your monthly fixed expenses are $2,000, you could survive a 2-month job gap on $4,000 in savings. Most people have that. But if your monthly fixed expenses are $5,000, surviving the same 2-month gap requires $10,000 in easily accessible cash. Far fewer people have that. And the difference between those two situations isn't just a savings number. It's the negotiating position you walk into every single conversation with an employer. The person who needs this job is always going to get a worse deal than the person who wants this job. And the employment contract across the board rewards the person who can credibly signal that they don't desperately need the specific thing being offered, which is profoundly counterintuitive and almost never explained in plain language to people entering the workforce. Now, let's talk about where this is heading, because I think the interesting question isn't just why Gen Z is doing this, but what the second-order effects are going to be. Here is the thing about systems under pressure. They adapt or they break. The corporate employment model is a system under pressure. Right now, the traditional levers for retaining talent, title, pension, job security, they're all weakened or gone. The remaining lever is compensation. And there's a growing awareness that compensation transparency is making it harder to hide the gap between what someone is worth and what they're being paid. So companies are doing a few different things in response. Some are genuinely adapting. They're building internal mobility programs. They're doing market benchmarking more frequently. They're creating more transparent pay bands. They're offering equity broadly rather than just to senior employees. These companies are trying to make the internal belt move fast enough to keep talented people from stepping off to a competitor's belt. Some of them are actually succeeding at this. It's possible to build retention through genuine market alignment, but a lot of companies are responding in a much less functional way. They're trying to add psychological friction to departure rather than economic incentive to stay. Lengthy vesting cliffs on equity that only pay out if you stay 3 or 4 years. Complex bonus structures where the actual number only materializes if you hit arbitrary targets set 12 months in advance. Non-compete agreements in roles where non-competes make no logical sense. Performative culture work designed to make you feel guilty about leaving people you genuinely like. These are all friction strategies. They don't change the underlying economic math. They just make the decision to leave harder emotionally and logistically. And Gen Z is increasingly good at seeing through them. When you grow up with access to information that lets you decode these structures, you recognize a lock mechanism when you see one. The generation that watched their parents stay in loyalty relationships that didn't protect them is not going to sign a 3-year non-compete for a job paying below market. They're just not. And honestly, the companies that rely most heavily on friction retention are usually the ones least interested in fixing the underlying math, because if they were willing to fix the underlying math, they wouldn't need the friction. The friction is a symptom of a company that knows it can't compete on value and is trying to compete on switching cost instead. That's a losing strategy in the long run, because the talent with the most options is also the talent with the most leverage to negotiate away the friction. The people who sign the 3-year cliff vest at below market pay are usually the people who feel they have no choice. And those are not the people most companies most want to retain. Let me give you the 3-level framework I promised earlier in this video. 3 levels of how you can exist in the current labor market. And I want to be clear that these aren't moral rankings. They're just descriptions of different positions with different leverage profiles. Level 1 is belt dependency. This is the default. You are structurally reliant on a single employer for income. Your fixed expenses are calibrated to your salary. Your identity has some attachment to the institution. Your switching cost is high. The employer has significant leverage over you because the asymmetry of pain in the event of separation favors them. If they fire you, they absorb a temporary productivity gap. If they fire you, you absorb a financial crisis. That's not a balanced relationship. It never was. But belt dependency makes it feel like a balanced relationship because of familiarity. Level 2 is belt optionality. This is what strategic job movement creates. You still depend on employment income, but you have genuine credibility in the external market, demonstrated by recent interviews, competing offers, or a salary that's been tested against the market in the last 18 to 24 months. Your switching cost is lower because you've kept your expenses manageable and built a financial cushion. You don't need your current job. You're choosing it day by day. And employers can feel the difference between someone who is choosing to be there and someone who is trapped there. The former is a negotiating partner. The latter is a captive. Level 3 is belt independence. This is rarer and harder. Multiple income streams, some of which don't require your time in a linear way. Equity in things that grow whether you're watching them or not. Saving sufficient to cover 18 to 24 months of expenses without employment income. At this level, employment is genuinely optional. You might work because you find it engaging or because the specific opportunity is exceptional, but the baseline of your financial life doesn't require it. This is where leverage completely inverts. The employer is now trying to attract you. You're evaluating them as much as they're evaluating you. Most people reading job advice are stuck at level 1 and being given advice designed for level 3. The disconnect between where the advice assumes you are and where you actually are is one of the main reasons career advice is so consistently useless. The practical path from level 1 to level 2 doesn't require genius. It requires a few specific behaviors executed consistently. Keep your fixed expenses lower than your income growth. Every raise that doesn't immediately get absorbed into lifestyle expansion increases your optionality. Interview externally at least once every 12 to 18 months, even if you're not looking. Not to be disloyal, but to recalibrate your understanding of your market value. The discipline of staying current in your external market value is the discipline of not accidentally becoming a captive. Maintain relationships outside your current employer. Network is not a thing you do when you need a job. It's a thing you maintain so that when the opportunity or necessity to move arises, the friction is lower. And stop apologizing for the math. The cultural discomfort around job switching is a residue of the old psychological contract. It was always mostly in the employee's head. The company was never apologizing when it let people go in a restructuring. The asymmetry in the guilt distribution was never logical. It was engineered. Gen Z didn't invent mercenary employment. The companies did in the 90s and 2000s when they demonstrated through repeated action that the old loyalty security exchange was conditional on it being convenient for them. The generation is now being criticized for not performing loyalty, never saw loyalty actually rewarded in their formative environment. You can't train a new cohort on the old social contract by showing them evidence that it doesn't hold and then expecting them to sign it anyway. Here is where I want to land this because I think there's a version of the Gen Z job hopping story that gets told in a way that makes it seem like pure victory. And I want to complicate that slightly. The salary gains from strategic job movement are real. The negotiating leverage is real. The systemic critique of corporate loyalty culture is entirely valid. All of that is true. But there's a version of this behavior that tips from strategic to reactive in a way that ultimately doesn't serve the person doing it. If you're leaving every 18 months because you're optimizing a system, that's smart. If you're leaving every 18 months because staying anywhere for longer triggers an existential discomfort you haven't examined, that's something else. If you can articulate clearly what you're running toward with each move and the math supports it, you're in control of the system. If you're mostly running away from things that are uncomfortable without having a clear thesis about where you're going, the job movement might be generating salary increases while simultaneously preventing the depth of expertise that eventually creates the most valuable kind of leverage. There is a thing that happens around year 2 or 3 in most challenging roles where the work stops being learnable in obvious ways and starts requiring you to build something more idiosyncratic. Something that comes from having navigated the full cycle of a project or a market or a relationship enough times to develop actual judgment. Not just knowledge, judgment. And judgment is the thing that converts into the highest value career outcomes. The kind of outcomes that involve being the person in the room who everyone defers to, not because of their title, but because their track record of being right is undeniable. You can't collect judgment in 18-month increments the same way you can collect salary increases. Judgment is slower. It compounds differently. And some of the most valuable professional learning happens in the difficult period after the initial excitement of a new role wears off and you have to actually grind through the hard parts. So the 3 practical takeaways I want to leave you with are not the obvious ones. First one, stop treating job movement as inherently virtuous and start treating it as one specific tool in a broader strategy. The question to ask every 12 to 18 months is not, am I making enough money at this job? The question is, what is the net value of another year here in terms of compensation, learning, network, and optionality compared to what I could get by moving? That's a 4-variable calculation, not a 1-variable one. And depending on your specific situation, the right answer might be move, or it might be stay another year and use this time to build something specific. Second one, control your belt dependency before it controls your decisions. This is the most actionable thing in this entire video. Do the math on your monthly fixed expenses right now. Ask yourself how many months of employment gap you could survive with your current savings. If the answer is less than 3 months, that number is the actual constraint on your life right now. Not your skill level, not your ambition, not the job market. Your ability to absorb a gap. Fix that number in your negotiating position in every conversation with every employer. Changes immediately. Not gradually, immediately. Third one, know your market value in real time, not in theory. Having a vague sense that you're probably worth more than you're making is not useful. Going and testing that in an actual interview process is useful. You don't have to take the offer, but you should know what the offer would be. The information changes how you think, how you negotiate, and how you evaluate what you have. An employee who has no idea what the external market would pay them is an employee whose employer has all the information. You already know how that story ends. The conveyor belt is still there, is moving at the speed someone else set. The only genuinely strategic question is whether the belt you're on right now is the right one for where you're trying to go. And whether you've made that decision with actual information or with comfortable assumptions. Gen Z isn't refusing to apologize for leaving jobs out of arrogance. They're refusing to apologize because they understand, maybe for the first time collectively and at scale, that the apology was always just a mechanism for making the belt feel like a moral obligation rather than a market transaction. And that clarity, more than any individual salary negotiation, is the actual shift happening right now. Subscribe if you want to keep going. This stuff doesn't get simpler.